fellow and director at Bentley. His area of expertise is in the building performance, zero energy buildings, digital twins, smart cities, and Drew has been carried out this research throughout his life. He did his PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And before joining Bentley, he was developing the Energy Plus and US DOEs. He's involved with ASHRAE extensively in the development of standards and the other chair of the climate data and decarbonization tasks. So over to you, Drew.
Thank you, Maren. Okay, let's see here. I'm going to start up. Oh, no, sorry. Share. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I wish I could be there in person. Hope that's going to be possible soon. It was 2 years ago today that I gave my last in-person talk before the pandemic started. So it's much better to be able to see and talk to people, because just the presentation isn't just enough. But I appreciate the invitation today. I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, building simulation, because my career has been kind of centered around that. So I'm going to talk about what is in the black box of simulation today, and that's going to be the focus. So I like to always start my talks with talking about why do we even bother to care about energy, other than, of course, the costs associated with it. Energy is responsible for a large chunk of environmental damage and also carbon. Globally, worldwide, if you look at the left bar, the world impact of buildings is about 30% in terms of energy. It's about same or maybe a bit higher for the carbon impact. And of course, with a recent focus on carbon and energy in general, it just makes that even larger. Globally, though, industry is still responsible for more than buildings, but that changes as economies change. And two best examples of it, the third and fourth bars here. China, about 20% of their total energy use are buildings today. And a decade, 15 years ago, that was half that amount. So the Chinese economy, while growing, is also creating a huge number of new buildings. Still responsible for 70% energy use is the industrial sector. But that varies quite a bit. If you look at just the next bar, Hong Kong, less than 5% is industry, but 65% is in the buildings, not to be, not unexpected for Hong Kong. But that's kind of the two extremes of what you see in there. If you go kind of the center and then the last bar in the center where Europe is, the UK, it's about 40%. It's actually very similar to the US in terms of energy use. Transportation's a bit higher in the UK, with about 25% left in industrial. But I'm going to focus my next couple slides on the US because I have good data about end uses. I try to present that where I can. So for the US, we're at 40%, a little more than half in our residences. Up till about 10 years ago, it looked like the commercial sector, the non-residential sector, was going to overtake and be the strongest sector, but it really hasn't recovered from the economic downturn of a decade, 12 years ago. Oops, sorry. But if we look at residential, and this is really kind of the important parts of it, we have to look at it as a whole. Our residences, we used to think of them as, primarily energy used for heating, water heating, probably less so cooling in the UK, but then our appliances and maybe even the computers and some of the other things going on. But if you look at the bottom bar, we now have, at least in the US, we're seeing that a full quarter of energy uses are small energy uses. These are the things like the cell phones and all the devices that are connected. In my own house, I have 22-year-old twins, which are away at university right now. But when they're home, we can see 19 or 20 devices connected to the Wi-Fi system. So it's become, they're small pieces, but they're also very important. And they add up to be quite a lot of energy use. So we have to not just worry about the main parts there, the heating sector or some of the appliances and other things. We have to worry about all of it in total. And similarly, in the commercial sector, there is really not a single building type. This is averaged across all the building sector. Apologies, I've got allergies already. So for example, if we had a grocery store or supermarket, refrigeration would be probably 50% of the energy use, and cooling and lighting secondary results there. If it's an office building, probably a combination of heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, and equipment. And so we need to look at the combination of all of those pieces. And again, other uses, this is beginning to include things like all our interior transportation, our lifts, escalators, moving sidewalks, all the other things in addition to that that you're not seeing there. They're small uses. We have to cover the whole sector and look at all the uses if we're going to really make inroads into improving the efficiency. In the US, ASHRAE standards work in the energy area began 35 years ago, or actually 55 years ago, sorry. 45, I'll get the number right here in a second. 1975, ASHRAE published the first energy efficiency standard for buildings, 90-75, and had progressively been improving that. And you see the latest version of that published in 2019. There'll be a new version this year as well. They update every 3 years, but the changes in the percentage of drop for that have been slowly getting down to where they're a few percent, maybe 6 or 7. And I think the preliminary number shown there for 2019 actually increased to about 6.5% reduction. But at this point, we're looking at our buildings are already using 70% less energy than would have been allowed under the standards of the previous century. The green building standard from ASHRAE 189 has already been working as well. They tend to be a bit ahead of 90.1, partly because they're based on 90.1, and then they are updated kind of out of sequence. So they're a bit more, so that we're seeing down in the 75% or more range. And so that's continuing to get there, but also we're all seeing a point at which there's not much else that can be done from a code standpoint to reduce the energy use in buildings. It's got to be an integrated approach, not just a prescriptive. So let's talk a little bit about modeling and simulation. And for many of you, this is not going to be new. I'm just trying to be lay the groundwork here. But so a definition from the dictionary, a model is a schematic description of a system and can be used for further study. So when we're talking about modeling in an energy situation, that's what we're doing. It is a derived description of what's going on there for further use. If we're doing simulation that's specifically mathematical, so that you're creating that model and then using the variables to determine the effects on other variables. So we create a model of a building, and we're going to simulate how it reacts to changes in environment or changes in technology, or maybe some of the building systems related to it. So what do we mean by building simulation? Specifically, we're talking about software, and we're talking about dynamic interaction of heat, light, mass, and sound within a building. And we're trying to predict what's going on with its energy and environmental performance, as it relates to changes in climate, occupants, systems, and even now noise sources, because we're not talking strictly about the building energy here. It does go beyond that. So building performance simulation, in my opinion, is still much more art than science. The science is pretty well established in terms of the simulation tools themselves. The art is in understanding and knowing what the information is that you need to be presenting. And excuse me, what you can, what information is important, what the level of detail is, and how that should be put together. And what do you do when you don't have the information? So that's really kind of the art part of it. Issues related to maintaining building in a model, the data throughout the life cycle. We need to be training users to think about simulation methods and different ways of attacking a problem, not the tools themselves. Yes, you need to understand how tools are, but I think we spend too much time worrying about particular tools and how we can trick those tools or do a workaround. And that's not a useful way of looking at it. There are other more accurate ways of trying to do that. And anytime you try to trick a tool, you're depending on your understanding of what goes on in the tool to know whether it's going to work or not. And that's kind of risky. Our tools also tend to get behind. New technologies come, and it's difficult in many tools to be able to model those quickly unless the developers are staying up to date. And if we can't simulate a technology or system, it becomes a real challenge. Getting data from existing BIM models is still a challenge, and I think I've seen some great steps forward in that, but we've been working on this problem for decades to be able to have data from what should be a ready source of information about a model. But at the same time, we don't have BIM models for many buildings out there. Much of the stock was built from pen and paper, not from electronics. Green buildings, sustainable design, and policy have been driving simulation more than energy costs over the last decade, probably more so than the previous 3 decades. So, whether it's LEED in the US or BREEAM or Energy Performance Directive throughout the EU or California's Title 24 and CalGreen or ASHRAE standards. Really, those have been pushing the need for them. In California, it's become essentially impossible to comply with the energy code there, the Title 24, without using simulation because the code has gotten so stringent. And the simulation allows you more flexibility than you would have otherwise. So what are some of the trends that I've been seeing? Well, lots of new tools, lots of capabilities. Interoperability has been kind of a buzzword for many years. Building Smart's been working on this problem for almost 30 years. There are XML schemas for this, also BIM standards, both nationally and internationally. Great strides in visualization, being able to use that in some of the virtual reality or even augmented reality opportunities. And then integration, reusing the same model of the physical attributes to be able to reuse, whether it's thermal or CFD or electrical IQ or visual. So being able to reuse that and that having that integration to make it easier. A lot more interested in embodied energy. Decarbonization is a big topic today. I know SIBSI has just released a new TM guide on this recently, and ASHRAE has a decarbonization task force of more than 150 people looking to provide information to members and global audience for that. And also continued interest in emissions as a piece there. So we're seeing a lot more tools customized to user needs. So we have kind of a challenge there. But users want to be able to do more with less effort, and that is an overall a challenge, because when the user allows the developer to provide shortcuts, they're depending on the software developer to make sure they understand the process is needed, and it may not match what the user is attempting to do. So I always say, make sure you understand very clearly what the default values are that are being provided in any tool that you use. Because I work for a software company, and the developers that I've worked with often are just C coders, and they don't maybe understand the building's physics there, and may or may not get that right. So be very careful when you're using a tool to make sure you're getting the things that you need, and the defaults make sense. So let's talk about types of tools. There's a whole series that you're probably familiar with for the building practitioners, and this includes very simple tools for overall performance, maybe peak temperature prediction or heating, cooling, load calculation. So they may not be tools per se, they could even be spreadsheets. But then we have the more complex tools that many people use to do sub-hourly or hourly simulation, to be able to look at some of those components there. And that's not really fully interactive, or it's not giving that immediate response, but it is a good substitute for that. So then we also have a series of specialist packages, which you need to understand the processes, the CFD particularly. If you don't know generally what the answer is, you may not know whether your simulations work. Acoustics and 2 and 3D conduction calculations, and probably not something that most practitioners would work with on a daily basis. And then there are integrated systems that may combine components of those into packages that work together. So why do we bother using simulation? Well, it allows us to make decisions, to understand the impacts of actions we may take throughout design into construction and even into operation. That also lets us say, if we do a simulation and find that heating is the biggest issue, then we can focus there first and be able to focus the efforts where they make the most effective use of resources. It allows us to look at alternatives throughout the building design process, even into construction and operation and retrofit. So is this window better than that window if I'm considering that, or should I insulate? But what about efficiency of heating and cooling equipment? Where can I make changes there? It also allows you to do prediction of performance against benchmarks or project goals. So you want to set a goal to get to 50% below the energy standards. And so you need to be looking at that early to be able to attack the opportunities for that, and be able to challenge things that are not helping you get there. And frankly, it's cheaper than constructing the wrong building. It's cheaper to do simulations and constructing and paying for the wrong building. That energy impact may be for 30, 40, 50 years. And so you need to be 1 year or less of cost to do an energy simulation is going to pay back many times over throughout its life. So this is an example from a building I worked when I was at Department of Energy. This was an early attempt at doing a very low energy building. They didn't get to zero initially, they have since. But this, typical pie chart, HVAC at 59%, lights at 13. Oh, that looks pretty good. And then internal equipment at 28. But I need to look at the details of that. I need to understand what's going on. So if we start kind of going from the top right with electric boiler, we designed heat pumps, or they designed heat pumps. Why is the electric boiler taking almost 25% of the energy? What they found was that the sequence was backwards of what it should have been, that the heat pump should come on and the electric boiler was only to come on when the heat pumps could not meet the load. And this unfortunately led to them not meeting their energy cost savings goals, because the electric rate was set by the highest peak in any one of the previous 11 months. And so that was a real problem for it. It could have saved them a lot more money. Also, wastewater treatment, unusual building. It has its own, what they call a living system. It's basically plants and other biologicals that are helping to clean the water, the wastewater as it comes out of the building. The wastewater is cleaner, but it has a 10% impact here. And although we don't really think about it in many of our buildings because we don't treat our own wastewater, we don't count the pumping to get water into our buildings, it's about 10% of the energy use of most buildings at the municipal level. So it's still a large amount of energy that's going on. So water efficiency is also important. Another thing, there are 2 energy recovery units, but they're actually adding to the energy use. And the problem they found was that the recovery units had clogged filters, which were impossible to get to because of the duct configuration. So it was actually adding to the energy load in the building, trying to get air through those units. Elevator. Well, you wouldn't. This is a 2-story building, so you wouldn't think the lifts in this building would be very very large impact because it was a hydraulic system, so it should have been very small. But what they found out was there was a heater on the hydraulic fluid that was only supposed to be on in the 2 or 3 coldest winter months, and unfortunately was on 24/7. It was driving the energy use of the lift more than the actual movement of the lift. And so once they figured that was a control issue, could be fixed. Looking next, the PV system consumption. This building was built at a time that not all the systems worked together. We had PV panels, but getting the power to the building through inverters and other systems wasn't working. So there was a loss of almost 5% of energy use just due to issues with the PV system. The last area is to look at lights. I said it looked pretty good at 13, but if you start to look at the top, parking lot, sidewalk, emergency, 10% of that 13 are outside the building. What they didn't know until they were doing the evaluation was that the building was using, had all its exterior lights were turned on at sundown and stayed on until sunrise, and far more than were needed for security or any other purposes. This was a college campus. So they were able to reduce that and pursue. So we need to look at the detail. The more we understand about how energy is used, the more we can find ways to cut this even further. And this is the that building I was just talking about with the pie chart. So throughout this, finding that simulation is kind of a critical tool to support building design and operation. It helps you make those decisions we've been talking about and selecting the best combinations. But simulations are just that. Real buildings will use more energy, they'll produce less power if there's PV. Controls don't work as they do in simulations. They're ideal in simulation, and that's not how they work. Occupants can't complain very loudly if you're in a simulation. Just a few hours uncomfortable doesn't say anything, but a real person will. And it comes down to garbage in, garbage out. The less we know about how the building's operated, the less likely we're going to be able to predict it. This is a great quote, not specifically about building performance, but from Stuart Brand, who has a great book. This is from 20 years ago, How Buildings Learn and What Happens After They're Built. And what I love is his quote that every building's forecast and every forecast is wrong. And he's right. It's what we're forecasting, their use is just not going to happen. And the best example of that's on the cover of the book. These are 2 buildings built in New Orleans in 1857. So kind of traditional, what would have been Federalist style here in the US at that time. And pretty simple, and they're effectively twins. But here's what they look like 150 years later. You can't even hardly tell that they're the same building. The one on the left's got some of the New Orleans wrought iron added. The one on the right's got more traditional balcony and other aspects added to it. So it is a very different sort of look. And our buildings start evolving immediately when we start using them because they don't quite meet what we need and they're not what we're doing. So our prediction is not going to be what happens in reality. So let's talk about what's inside the black box. The ASHRAE 2021 Fundamentals Handbook is probably the best source of good information about that. Chapter 19 has information about all the energy estimating and modeling methods. Some of my presentations derive from that, but also from other things as well. Early days of simulation, there was a program, a heat balance program, NBSLD for National Bureau of Standards loads, and they were almost treating the interconnections of heat flows like a electrical circuit. So you'd have resistance through insulation, etc. And so they were being able to do there. And this is from a summary that the author of that created 20 years ago, George Walton. There's a history that's also been done in several papers, many of the foundational algorithms from the 20s through the 1950s, and then beginning to use computers in the 60s. ASHRAE started with a task group on energy resources, which are really looking at how the calculation methods are. 1971, the U.S. Postal Service or Post Office created a simulation program using some of that information, but they went down a path of what's called weighting factors, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. That path led on to a program from NASA. NASA had an energy program. Also, then that was then repackaged for California and ERDA, and ERDA was a predecessor to the Department of Energy. And that is the series that then became DOE2. The other method, the National Bureau of Standards I just talked about, the NBSLD, that led to a series of other programs that were focused more on a heat balance method rather than weighting factors. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those changes. On through the 80s, and we're getting lots more there. So we have DO2 and BLAST kind of being the two representatives of the weighting factors in that, but there's also TRACE and TRANSIS and many other programs out there as well. And this is not comprehensive. It doesn't include ESPR or some of the other tools that are available. So just to let you know, a lot more has been going on throughout the history and to where we were about 10 years ago. So within the building simulation area, there are three major simulation methods or families of methods, and these kind of each have their own strengths. Weighting factors and transfer functions, they're very fast, but they're limited. We'll talk about what the limitations are for that. They were created in the days when we were talking about punch cards for computers. If you don't know what a punch card is, go do a Google search on it afterwards. That's how I started my career in the 70s, was with programs I had to literally load a deck of punch cards into the system. There's heat balance, where we're talking about trying to describe all the interconnections of how heat flows within a building, or heat or other flows, can be light as well. It's more accurate, but it takes more time, longer computational time. And then the thermal networks, where instead of having kind of pre-configured heat balance, you would go even more in the ability to be able to describe a system in more detail. It's very accurate, very flexible, but can be long computational. It takes some expertise to know how to set up the networks. So what happens in the weighting factors, internal heat gains throughout the building surface, or not just internal, but through building surfaces are pre-calculated depending on temperature and other things. Then what that means is then I have a table or a matrix that's set up to be able to say what the heat flows are going to be at different temperature combinations. The one weakness of them, they use a combined radiative convective heat transfer coefficient, which basically sets radiation and convection at the same level, and no, they don't do that at all temperatures. So that kind of limits the accuracy of radiant systems, which it's unfortunate. But they also have constant convective coefficients, so that is also one of the inaccuracies or limitations there, so that you won't get uncontrolled or floating room air temperatures accurately. So if you're trying to do temperature prediction, it's not the tool for you. It's a good tool for looking at overall impacts. It also doesn't allow material properties to vary. They're kind of fixed. It doesn't matter what the temperatures are going on. So phase change materials are kind of out the door. So what you see there is DO2, EQuest, DO 2.2, IESVE, HAP, and TRACE are kind of in that set of families. But recently, and I'll explain why on HAP and TRACE, their new versions of their programs are moving on. So heat balance looks at all the flows, whether it's conductive, convective, radiant, and creates a heat balance for every surface in the zone. Fewer assumptions, more explicit explanation of what you need to be able to do. And so it more accurately calculates the radiant energy. So you get better accuracy in your temperature and humidity. It requires more calculations because it's not doing a single solve at a time step. It may have to do some iteration to find that. So it can be more computer time. Early tests of DO2 versus BLAST, and they're not quite equivalent, but about 4 times more execution time for BLAST. But there are other things you can do to deal with that. The other thing is the convective coefficients can be calculated runtime rather than pre-calculated, which makes airflows around surfaces more accurate as well. So we've got BLAST, the ASHRAE radiant time series cooling loads, Energy Plus, Transys, and now TRACE 3D, and HAP has a new program underway as well. Thermal network, explicit network, really, you have to have a matrix to describe all the heat and energy flows. So you are explicitly describing what's going on. There are no assumptions. It's flexible, physically rigorous, but it requires much more input, explicit input describing exactly what you're trying to do. It can require more calculations because there's some iterations that'll have to happen, but it's often a good trade-off if you're trying to be very accurate. So ESPR, IDA-ICE are 2 examples of that. Other differences, if you look at the DO2 family versus the Energy Plus family, they're kind of a separate. In DO2, 2.1e, for example, you would calculate all the loads for the entire year, the 8760 hours. They would then get passed to a system analysis, which would pass the system loads onto the plant. There was no feedback. And what that led is to loads not met, if you're familiar with that in either DO2 or EQuest. EQuest did a bit more merger of that with the loads and analysis. There was some feedback, but there's still some sort of limit on that as well. In Energy Plus, there's feedback at the time step, and that means where loads can't be met at the system or plant level, you will see those reflected in rising temperatures if you're cooling, or humidity changes, or other things directly within the simulation. So let's talk about daylighting and lighting. There's a whole thing, and I'm not expecting you to see there, but they're kind of 2 major paths there, and 3 major lighting calculation methods. Split Flux was created to kind of give simple configurations with a fast computational time. And think of DO2 had the Split Flux method. Radiosity, accurate for most configuration, very fast computational time, but doesn't account for different types of surfaces, whether they're translucent, transparent, or specular. Ray tracing is the most accurate. You can create photorealistic images, sorry, but it can take a while. I can remember simulations of a room or even a few rooms taking a full day a few years ago, but that's improved as well. So let's talk about each of these. Split Flux basically uses a daylight factor method, not unlike the weighting factor, based on the sum of the sky, anything externally reflected and internally reflected. So kind of a simple, easy way, very accurate for simple configurations. Anytime you get into anything unusual, it'll be won't work very well. Limitations, it's an average single value for an entire zone, and it does not model specular reflections. However, in Energy Plus, they did do some work on the split flux to be able to do grids and to be able to take basically subdivide a lighting zone into subzones to be able to do calculations. So that's Energy Plus. Of course, that came out of the DO2 part of it. eQuest and Ecotech are examples of that. So that's kind of you got the sky component, you have the externally reflected, and you have the internally reflected. And those together are what you see at a single point. Radiosity, it calculates radiation transfer among surfaces. Now, we're talking about light transfer. It's very similar to what a heat balance is. And it's accurate for most configurations and structure. You can combine it with split flux to increase the accuracy of those calculations. It'll create view-based images, but they're not photorealistic. They're pretty flat looking, and we'll see that. It also does not account for light contributions from transparent, translucent, or specular surfaces. So DLux, D-Light, there's a version of that in Energy Plus, and also AGI 32. So that's what a radiosity image looks like. You can see the shadows, and it looks pretty accurate, but it's not a photorealistic. It's a pretty flat image in terms of that. There's no spark to it because it can't do that specular reflection that we'll talk about in the other. Ray tracing is the most accurate. Point-specific lighting calculation you can do. It follows a given reflection of rays outward to light sources in the scene. So it is basically tracing where the light or where the reflections are coming from. Very accurate. You can put pretty complex systems together, and it does create very photorealistic images, and I've got a couple examples of those. But it can be slow, depending on what you're trying to do. I know ESPR has implemented a version of this. Also, Energy Plus in some of the tools now can do that as well. So Radiance, which is a public domain program, Spot, DaySim, Diva, most of them all derive from Radiance as an engine, but providing useful interfaces. Ray tracing, just take a quick look here. There's a camera, and it creates an image based on where the rays are coming from and around that particular object. These are radiance images. These are produced with simulation based on inputs there, so you can have a lot of accuracy, and it can feel more like some of the renderings that you see out of the BIM tools today. But in this case, it's photorealistic and photometrically realistic that we're getting useful. So this is from ESPR, being able to actually measure light levels coming into a space, seeing glare problems for that. They use a fisheye view to be able to look at a whole room, being able to look at how changes to different technologies can help improve that glare problem. Or here's one from Lawrence Berkeley Lab from a while ago, looking at different combinations of time of year, but also glass. So first column is clear glass, tinted glass, and then electrochromics as a third column. And being able to look at here's a December day at the top row, a mid-June day, and a spring day on the bottom row. And you can see the challenges that each of them do, but they can give you a photorealistic view of what's going on and seeing where you're going to have hotspots and glare problems. So many tools. Where do we start? Well, the handbook, ASHRAE handbook, is actually a pretty good starting point. It does not talk about tools specifically. That's part of ASHRAE's thing, is not to talk about that, but it's a good, if you're trying to understand the basics of the methods, and I've not covered some of the statistical methods and some of the deep learning and AI-based things, but it does cover those as well. There's also a book that came out of IBSA, Building Performance Simulation for Design and Operation, updated just a couple of years ago, has chapters on a wide range of of things. There was also a report that we did about 15 years ago that had 20 different programs and kind of tried to, in a very quick brush view, look at what the combinations of capabilities were across the various tools. 20 different tools were covered there. There's also a software directory that currently has about 200 tools in it from ABIPSA USA. You can get it at buildingenergysoftwaretools.com. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this report just to give you sort of a feel. So you'll recognize many of the tools. So there are 20 tools across the top, and then there are general modeling features there. And you may be able to see there are a lot of footnotes. And the problem was that we needed really to go in a lot more depth for that. But it begins to give you a feel for which of the tools have certain capabilities and which don't. So that's at least a starting point to see whether it'll help you. Now, this is 15 years old, so tools will have changed. So there's a table on zone loads, another one on building envelope and daylighting, HVAC, economics, and other there. John Hand at Strathclyde and I have been trying to find a way forward to try to update this. We're trying to look at kind of a new generation comparison for that. We haven't got much traction, partly because it's a bit of a daunting tool or task. We want to try to take the existing report and update it, expand it where it needs to be. Ultimate goal is really to take it to something like this, is to a website so that it can be updated and be able to do side-by-side comparisons for various topics and to be able to work on that. We haven't made much progress on that, partly because I think it's just it's a lot of work each tool, and essentially expecting the developers to decompose a lot of the information they have. So various combinations of things there. So things that John had lifted from ESPR and also from Energy Plus. Another thing that's very important is testing and validation. You need to make sure your tool is tested, not just the internal tests that they may do for that, but some of the standards. There are ISO standards, there's IEA work and best tests. ASHRAE has standard 140, which has been under development for more than 20 years, and it's been slowly bringing in all the IEA best tests, but also a number of other things that are going. You need to be able to ask, where are the test inputs and results? I want to see how you compare. Many of the codes out there require that the tools are being tested just to make sure that they're there. Every tool that's been tested has been shown to have some issues related to it, and so it is important that we cover all of that. So what should I look for? Well, Chapter 19 talks about these 7 items. Accuracy, sensitivity, versatility, speed and cost, reducibility, ease of use, and validation. From my standpoint, speed and cost, reproducibility, and ease of use have all got to be kind of baselines for any tool. But I want to be sure it's accurate, that it's sensitive to the changes I'm looking at, so that if I'm doing something that it doesn't have a system for, it's probably not going to be sensitive to some of the variables I'm interested in. And also that it's validated and tested. I think that's very important as well. So how do I choose tools? And I don't encourage people to have a tool. First, you will need different tools for different types of analysis. So what are you trying to assess? If it's a simple change of performance, maybe a BIM method or degree day, pretty simple spreadsheet sort of a calculation may be enough. But if you're starting to see interactions among building systems, you probably need to look at some of these more dynamic, at least hourly simulation tools. Make sure the tool works with the type of physics you're interested in. If you're interested in radiant systems or daylighting or ground heat transfer or a specific HVAC, make sure it can do it before you're starting to look at it. I also want to talk a little bit about a relatively new standard, Standard 208, 209, published in 2018. The standard has been, committee has been reformed, and they're beginning to look at opportunities for updating that. So these are from some of those issues. So one of the things we know about, it's easier to make changes early before decisions are cast in stone and before they have ripple effects. So the sooner we can get simulation done, the more impact it'll have, and the less effort it'll be. Unfortunately, typically energy modeling is toward that time frame. So what the standard does is put a series of simulation cases together, minimum requirements for doing that, and then describes that. It's not required for all buildings, although it is cited in 90.1 and 189 at this point. It's about using simulation during design. It's so focused on people that are trying to either contract for or are interested in using different simulation methods. So the compliance is pretty simple. You have to do a climate and site analysis. You have to do benchmarking. What do other buildings of this building type in this location use in terms of energy? There needs to be a charrette focused on setting goals, and those goals need to be part of the owner's program or requirements. Then there's some general modeling cycle requirements, and you have to do one set of models, and that's all it takes to comply at this point. There are different levels, and we're looking at it saying, if you're trying to do more detail, what those involve. But there are also these different cycles where simple box, conceptual, HVAC, design refinement, integration, or value engineering. And that's one of those things you have to do. So what about creating simulation model for BIM? I said earlier it was kind of difficult. BIM, we all know what BIM is, trying to represent a 3D representation of including geometry and spatial relationships and how things fit together, as well as their components. Often very graphical, interactive. And then SIM, we've been talking about, is really looking at how do we take the information, the geometry and all that other part, and used to get the building performance. So from the modeling standpoint, the model and the modeling are kind of involved, but using the software to really look at the attributes of the building and how it goes together. And BIM is widely used at this point. I don't think it's widely well used, but I think that's a work in progress today. So the idea is to be able to have and share that information. So here's an example of a project I worked on many years ago. This is a corporate headquarters, and you see the bars are changing. And that's partly because information was changing. So working on this project, we started in early design before there was even an initial design through construction documents. Increasing details, we had to go back and revisit. We often had to throw the models out. So here's the early design model, kind of sinuous, just a single corridor shape, not too complicated. And that's kind of the second bar. When we get to the design development phase, it's changed, has now gotten to be sort of X-shaped with a sort of an atrium in the center. And that's in the middle part where it says DD. And oh, they forgot to tell us about the computer center that was going to be in there. And so that wasn't part of the initial plans. And then we get on to construction documents. Now we have fully developed things. We have a cafeteria. We have an auditorium, other things, and the atrium is now quite a central part of the building. But at the same time, if you look at my chart, it's showing the energy code and then the design development energy code with the computer and without the computer, showing the various components there. And fortunately, we were still, because we were monitoring throughout design, still being able to do. But essentially, I had to reconstruct the geometry for this project every time we were dealing with it. If it's an existing building, how are you going to put that together? No details, probably no drawings. That's become. So anytime you have to do manual input, you're going to have errors and omissions. If you've got the virtual data, and I personally prefer 2D CAD or even just floor plans to BIM at this point, because I spent so much time cleaning up the BIM model. You probably have very robust geometry, but you may not have thermal-physical properties. They may be there, there may be space for them in the BIM, but I don't see them very often. So 2D workflow might have a drawing, and we have to create that in there, create an energy model and do analysis results. That's pretty good to work from. It's often not as fast as some others. What if we could take the BIM model through an analytical model, and there are various methods of getting there, and then on to energy. If that's more seamless, that is going to speed up the process quite significantly. The analytical model solves some of the issues of the BIM, makes sure spaces are enclosed. A lot of BIM models don't have floors in them, which I find interesting, but also just creating all the space of getting them closed and making sure the boundaries are there. But BIM is not the same as Father's Care. When I started out, this was a very specialized workstation. We had somebody working at 24 hours a day because it was too expensive to let sit idle. And so there were shifts of people working on it. But it's not like that today. Today, here's somebody working basically off their laptop and being able to design. And it's not even a building today. This is a golf course he's working with and using lots of different inputs for that. But it doesn't have to stay in the office. It can now be on our tablets, and being able to take various views and being able to look at that in the field, even to see what should be, for example, up in the ceiling, and being able to compare that at the field. So BIM to Sim, Building Smart has been in this for a while with the industry foundation classes. Most BIM software will do at least geometry. Some of them will take it further. It's been around for 20 years, still pretty complex to be able to deal with, but it is limited to what they can do. GBXML, another kind of independent to look, very focused more on the energy side of things rather than the BIM side, being able to translate. Autodesk bought a product called Green Building Studio. Most of that has been pulled into their product, particularly Revit today, to be able to work on that. But then Autodesk, Bentley, and Graphisoft have all have built-in simulation capabilities now. At least on the conceptual level, you can begin to look at that. And I really still believe interoperability is key to getting this done. It's just very difficult to do. I've seen some very elegant solutions for solving that where they went very cleanly, but that's because somebody spent some time in a BIM model to try to solve some of the issues they knew would come out if they took it forward just as it came from the design team. So it's kind of a challenge still today. But there are ways of doing it that are very quick. This is a paper I found. I'm just doing a scan on talking about floor plans, and this was a paper from master's students at Stanford, and they were looking at trying to auto-create floor plans based on relationships and where how houses should be configured. So this has a floor plan there, able to bring that in, but it's a PDF, and fortunately it has dimensions on it, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do it, because PDFs have no dimensions. But in this program, able to trace out the building in about 10 minutes, including all its windows, to be able to get at least the first floor set up there. Similarly, this is somebody has digitized their BIM model. This was taking it directly from through GBXML to do it. This school system in Australia, they were looking to see if they could do simulation of natural ventilation. It's a little difficult to see. The bottom right, you can see a little bit darker green windows. Those are clear story windows that lead between the classrooms and the hallway. It was configured to be able to do that, but in 10 minutes, I was able to create a model pretty quickly. Also, I mean, it's as simple, all the tools, all the BIM tools, and just about all the simulation tools will take just any image you have. So you can scribble out something on a scrap piece of paper and then just turn it into a model, and very quickly. So this is 5 minutes of work to create an 8-story building. Intentionally didn't straighten it out just to show definite. So some of the challenges, existing buildings mean no model drawings. So we're going to be doing takeoffs. We're going to be doing measurements and probably going to make some errors. It always happens. And all this time in collecting the data, that's not really what our focus is. We're trying to use our tools to evaluate alternatives. So there are several technologies, not so new in many cases, but new to the building sector. LiDAR, been out there for a while, but it's the idea you put a device in the center of a room and it sends out a ray of light and measures the reflection back and creates a very accurate model. Can be time consuming. There's some interesting handheld versions of that today. Photogrammetry has been around for decades. It essentially uses automated triangulation off photographs to mathematically create 3D mesh. The more accurate your photos and how far they overlap, the better you're going to get to do. It works well with aerial surveys, working with a number of projects right now in Dublin and Ahmedabad and in Lithuania, where we're working with the cases to be able to create this. This is King's Cross, I believe. This is a LiDAR image of it. This was when I guess the Elizabeth line was going in. This was 10 years ago. They were trying to get an accurate model because they had no idea where everything was and everything was having to interact. But platform 93/4 being there. But you can see the accuracy of that when you go forward. You can begin to even read signs because the light reflection is able to do. So you can measure very accurately from this information that's provided. Photogrammetry, here's a model of Paris. This was shot many thousands of pictures from a plane, but being able to put that together, the accuracy can be down in the 5 to 10 centimeter range. I often don't see it quite that far, but you can get to the point where you can measure exactly widths of streets, buildings, etc., off these particular models. This is an example of this La Madeleine over left bank, and you can see the model. It's not, there's some inaccuracies there. The columns on the front of it are not quite well rendered, but the more pictures you have, the better that can be. But what underlies that is a mesh. And from that mesh, you can then extract the information and create a model. All the BIM models will work with the meshes and the point clouds from the LiDAR and the photogrammetry. So you can create these from photos. I've also seen there's a indoor reality group that had a walking backpack, and that orange, yellow, and blue lines, that was the information they were collecting as they're walking through. They did a comparison of doing a field study by hand or doing this, and in less than a day, they collected information in a 6,000 square meter building, and it would have taken a month for consultants. They did a comparison to show that. So can I get a model? IFCs, GVXML are quick ways of doing that. If you need more detail, LiDAR can do that. Photogrammetry can really provide a lot more on that. Even smartphones today are being able to use that. And then you can bring that data in to the analysis tools. So, summary. For solution methods, what's inside that black box is probably as important as anything you do with it. Then the interface of the results. Understanding the underlying methodologies is really important so you can understand their limitations. Simpler ones are going to be limited. You're trying to do complex work, but sometimes a spreadsheet is good enough. Getting the data from these 3D models is becoming easier, but it does take some skill in trying to understand how that data gets translated into something else. The other problem I see is that some tools do a direct conversion and they give you a model, but you don't know what the defaults are in there, and that can take much time to be able to deal with it. It also comes down how good my simulation results are depends entirely on how good the input is. So back to garbage in, garbage out. The more you have about the building and how it operates, the more you can expect your results to reflect reality. All these tools are powerful. They allow you to compare different systems, even contrast how they operate and their controls and everything else, and throughout the life cycle. So they are a really powerful way of looking at buildings. Are these tomorrow buildings? Well, only if an owner wants to pay for them. The one there on the left is a building on the Côte d'Azur. A French couturier had it. It's a very strange building. You can rent it, very expensive to rent, but it's wanted interesting spaces, so that's what they got. The other one's kind of a little community of these spheres in Netherlands. I'm not quite sure why, but that's what they wanted. So probably we're going to see more like what we see at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, whole campus of buildings that are looking to go towards zero energy. They don't look that different from what we see today, the whole campus. I mean, it's buildings. And we just have some additional PV related to it and how they interact with the site. Or these other buildings, there's the top left is a military base in Hawaii, and the whole housing area is zero energy because energy is so expensive there, on the order of about 15 to 20 pence per kilowatt hour. And it's so PV and solar thermal pay for themselves. Or one of our pharmacies, Walgreens, I guess it's Walgreens Boots now, did a prototype showing how they could go at least a 50% lower energy. They didn't get quite as far as they wanted. Or a zero energy building there in Seattle, which actually has a very large canopy related to it. So last segment I really want to talk about is just this one slide, is talking about metrics. My career had kind of been spent here, looking at reducing energy, peak demand, reducing capital costs or keeping capital costs down and reducing operating costs. But what I found is that there are a number of other things going on that I really should be looking at. If we don't talk about water, water is becoming a major issue. There are places in the US and the West Coast where they will probably not allow new construction because there's not water source to supply that. Indoor environmental quality, we want our buildings to be healthy and to be able to make sure, but if we're not measuring that and understanding, we're likely to have issues. Carbon decarbonization becoming an issue. But one of the things I also learned was kind of what is the business model? If it's a school, they probably think in terms of how much per student is this going to cost. If it's a hotel, their revenue model is occupied room. What is my cost to operate this per occupied room? If it's retail, it's probably sales, and that's more likely to be on a per square meter basis. My favorite, though, is the brewery. That reports their energy savings and their carbon reduction in terms of per barrel of beer they produce. I've also seen wineries doing the same thing, and it's just a interesting view. So we need to understand that business model to make sure that our information, we tend to normalize to per square foot, per square meter, but it's more important to understand their model and to give them information that would be useful to them. Last, there's a free resource, a climate data it's currently up through 2018. We're in the middle of updating this for through 2021. I hope to be able to tell you that's going to be live here in the next couple of weeks. It looks like we're going to have close to 15,000 worldwide locations, and that gives you kind of a indication of the density of the information that's available today, and that data will be up through 2021. So with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions, please, you can put it in the chat or unmute your microphones and speak. You can raise your virtual hand. So up to you. Thanks very much, Drew.
Thank you. too late on a Wednesday evening.
It looks like it. True. How do you think about the performance gap? How could these simulations and the new technologies help us to reduce the performance gap?
I think we need to be collecting a lot more information about how buildings are actually working and operating. I think we depend a lot on assumptions. I know that early in my career, rather than trying to figure out how buildings were actually using energy, they were just hang on a second. I'm trying to see the questions popping in. That they just surveyed the people preparing, the building owners, rather than getting any measurements. And unfortunately, a lot of that default information was used for more than a decade without revisiting it. And I think we've underestimated how our buildings use energy. Much equipment is left on, lights are left on, and we need to really understand how buildings